Checkout tracking by the NPD Group brings you a receipt collecting system that gathers data anonymously through technology we created, providing your businesses with answers.
Hi everybody, thanks for coming to my talk. As we have said, my name is Lyndsey Gallant. I'm the current art director at XMG Studio. So XMG, if you've heard about it, you may have heard things that are not necessarily indicative of what kind of company we are anymore. We've had a lot of changes since we were founded in 2009. So we are a mobile game studio. We make phone games, and we used to be very big. We used to be corporate. We used to have around 50 people. We made premium games and then freemium when that adapted to the App Store. And we would make kind of like other people's properties. But now we're very, very different. We're like a totally different studio from how we used to be. I don't really like the labels of corporate versus indie, because I feel like that kind of is an oversimplification of how games are made. But that's probably the best indicator, despite that, of what we are and what we do. So I have a lot of stuff, so I'm just going to like dive right into it. So we've made a few dozen games since 2009, and they're all totally, totally different. They have a wide array of visual styles. We're not the sort of studio that just has one style for all of our games. We have styles that are different based on what kind of game design it is, what kind of core mechanic we have, and what our target demo is. So this is actually the first game that our studio made. It's very like 2009, as you can tell by the visuals. It's called Pandemica. It was an AR game that was like back when people were really into that technology and before people really realized that it's kind of gimmicky. So it's, you know, the visuals are fine for what it was, but it's very emblematic of what was kind of in the App Store at that time. People weren't really super sure about what we could do with visuals. Everyone was kind of trying their best. People were kind of new to developing games for phones that weren't just like Snake and things like that. So everyone was kind of doing their best. So this was in the era of when our company was making premium type games. So we did pretty well on a lot of them. This game, Cows vs. Aliens, was one of the many premium titles we had that had millions and millions of downloads. Very, very successful, but retroactively, like the visuals aren't super strong. They're very emblematic of like that era of the App Store. So we kind of made games like that for a while. We made premium games. They were, you know, $1 or $2 each, as was typical of that time. And the visuals were, you know, they're not super strong. If you were to look at a game like this now in the App Store, it would not be super appealing. We were doing a lot of other people's creative properties, so we were doing like contracts for Inspector Gadget. We made a Ghostbusters game. We made a Degrassi high school game, which is like the Hail Mary of Canadian media, so we were really happy to be part of that. And then at a point, we started to adapt our visuals to our company and helping our company evolve, because we started to kind of see a flail after a while. We did really well at the premium thing. Freemium became big, and we kind of didn't adapt to that super well. So though we had a very, very strong start as a company, we sort of started to hemorrhage money at a point, and we realized that we need to do something different if we want this company to be sustainable. So this was around the time where we started to really change our approach to art and making our art much stronger. So this is actually, we did a visual overhaul of our Cows vs. Aliens game that did so well. And this is like the perfect like case study for what we were doing then visually and what we're doing now. So the games got like a lot prettier, and we started to put way more time into them. We started actually doing art direction back in the early like Wild West days of our company. The way that we set art direction was like the first artist who got to it, their style was the art direction, which is like super not sustainable. So we definitely changed our pipeline for how we treat visuals, which I'll get into in a little more detail later. And so this is one of the games that we're currently working on, called Gastrobots. So the general premise of this game is that you are a space cowboy robot who is delivering animals to the zoo in space. The ship is hit by a meteor, spoiler alert, and then all of the animals end up raining all over these planets that are made of food. So it's much more creative and weird than any of the previous games we made. It has a lot more personality, and we get much more positive reactions than when our games were, you know, a little bit more generic in their stylization and their creative direction. And then we also have this other game that's like totally different from where we used to be, which is called Project Giants. It's a narrative-driven puzzle game that I won't get too into it, but it's basically our statement on how we aren't happy with the idea that people being cynical is often equated with a mark of intellect. So we kind of wanted to take this very conceptual idea about things that we were unhappy with in the world and things that we want people to kind of examine through games as an art form. And so this is like our upcoming project on that. I'm very excited about it. This is kind of the game that I've wanted to make for a few years, and finally getting to make it in a company that like made an Inspector Gadget game is sort of a weird thing. And I didn't really properly realize that until I started going through making this presentation. That's just like, wow, this is a really weird company, and it's really changed a lot. And I think it's changed in a way that is so unique that it offers a good case study for how other people run their companies and how we can kind of take away best practices from all of the different places that our company has been. So this kind of asks the question, like, what happened around that weird era where we suddenly started giving more care into how we were approaching our visuals? So a lot of stuff happened. We severely reduced our team size, so we went from like 50-some people to 6 is our current team size now. We got rid of a lot of management. We changed the hierarchy, so it's a flat hierarchy, and we started doing a lot more visual development. Pre-visuals are so important now, and they were something that we didn't really properly pay attention to before, and I'll get into why in a bit. So really what it comes down to is like we made a lot of mistakes as a company, and we made them as a team though, which is something that you don't really get to experience a lot when you're in a company, because if you're in a company and you make a lot of mistakes, if the mistakes are truly bad mistakes, you don't get to keep being a company so that you can learn and experience from them. But we were very advantaged where we had all of these previous successes with our premium titles, that we were able to take those lessons and move them forward to trying to figure out how we could do freemium stuff. So it's kind of cool because while we all learned to get better at our core speciality, we also learned how to be a team better. We learned the nuances of the people within the team. We learned who was good at what and how we could build each other up. And we basically started to learn how to tap into the creative global brain, kind of the group brain, rather than a bunch of individuals that we have built ourselves up as a team. And I think a big part of that is just making mistakes. And I don't think mistakes are a bad thing. And I think that's something that as creative companies, we all need to be more attuned to. So this is us at our peak, and that's not even everybody because it was cold outside and not everyone wanted to be in this picture. But at our peak, we had over 50 people. And these people were divided into, we're doing roughly like three games at a time. So we had a bunch of small teams within our large team, and then all of those tiny teams had their own leads, which is, I think, pretty typical of like a mid-core studio. And this is our entire team now, minus one person who was going to get beer. So that's emblematic of where we're at right now. And it's the same patio. So it's super weird just seeing how many people are gone. And as a point, it wasn't like we fired 45 people. It was we actually split into a few different companies. So there were a few layoffs, but mostly it was just people migrated to different companies that were related to our kind of group of companies that our CEO was running. So it wasn't like a super sad ending. But despite that, when you tell people like, yeah, we have 6 people now, their reaction is usually like, oh, that sucks, I'm so sorry. Like, oh no, all your people are gone, that's terrible. And I really don't see it that way. I think that when you're in an indie studio, the smaller you are, the more adaptive you can be, the more quickly you can iterate on things and try things and garbage them and keep moving, which is really like what we all need to do in this industry because it moves so quickly. Your team needs to move that quickly. If you have less red tape, less management to go through, less bureaucracy to cut through, it can make it much more easy to be successful as a team in general. So here's kind of a look at the old XMG. We kind of refer to it as old and new as if they're 2 different companies because they essentially are. This is sort of what our old structure was. So we had managers, which was like the CEO, the VP, the executive producer, producers. So that big group of people that were kind of macro and quite removed from the process. Then we had our producers. We had a art lead and a dev lead for each smaller team, as I mentioned before. And then you have kind of the people in the trenches. So you have like your production artists and your regular developers and your front end and back end people and stuff like that. So the way it would work is we would get a game idea either through one of the people cooking up a game design, or we would get in a contract from a different company, and that would be given to the producers. Producers would sort of itemize that, make it all organized so that they could be given to the respective leads. The leads would figure out what the priorities were, what our direction was on that, and then that would go to the teams. And as you may notice, there is like not a lot of communication between those 2 groups. So it was kind of like everyone worked in their bubble and they did their thing. This was a point in the company where like all I was doing was painting backgrounds. So I'd come in and I'd paint backgrounds for 40 hours a week, and I'd listen to NPR, and if the game kind of looked weird, I was like, whatever, I'm painting my backgrounds. I'm doing my job well. And that's all I really cared about. And that's all a lot of people cared about. Because in this system where you're so removed from having any agency over what you're doing, why would you care? Why would you stick your neck out and possibly get in trouble or maybe say something that people are going to think that you're dumb if you're part of this big system that you don't feel like you're actually included in? So the way that we kind of structure it now is we have the game designer, which this is like a symbolic representative entity because the game design is not handled by one person. We have one person who kind of leads the charge, but then everybody gives their feedback on what they think is working for the game design. So this is kind of like symbolic entity that is the game designer. So the game design is king in this new structure. So we have art team and dev team, and that's not based on leads. So we do have leads in the studio, but they're part of the team. Our leads are no longer managers doling out itemized tasks that no one can question. They are more catalysts. So as the art director, I am a catalyst for this, and I count myself on being on the same level as the rest of the art team. So we basically get the game design in GDD form, some sort of loose GDD in the initial stages. That's given to the art team and the dev team. And then we talk about it. We talk about how can we make this as pretty as possible? How can we hit the exact visual design we want for our core demographic while still making sure it's feasible, while making sure the game runs efficiently and it looks good? So that cyclical process goes on until we sort of find a happy compromise between having a really pretty game that works, and then usually that means that we need to revisit the game design. And then this process happens until the game is done. It is iterative, it keeps going. We're always revisiting things, we're always talking about stuff, because things will come up and change as we're making a game, so we need to be constantly talking throughout that process. In the older days of our company, it was more typical that you would get like this one tablet of like, this is the GDD coming down from the gods, and it was not very wavering because everyone was so disconnected in the process. It was difficult to be like, hey, this one feature doesn't make any sense. Can we change that? Because if you're down in the trenches, it almost feels like that's something that you're not allowed to talk about. So as I mentioned before, like, I don't think that the traditional boss has a place in an indie studio. I think you need to be a catalyst. You need to be someone who helps your team be better than they could ever be without you, but that doesn't mean that you're better than them. That means that you're helping them to be the best version of themselves professionally. So you're basically like a paladin in Diablo. If anyone has played Diablo, you have like passive, nobody's played it because there's no nerds in here. It's just you're giving passive buffs to everybody. And you can take some hits and you can dole out some hits, but the main thing you're doing is making everybody better. So if anyone's played WoW, you're a resto shaman, if that makes more sense for people. So the nice thing is when you have everybody kind of on the same level and everybody is just working towards this greater good and trying to make everyone else better, it removes people who are not part of that process. You don't have people who are the executive producers who have no idea how to actually do these things. You don't have the art directors who have forgotten how to draw because they haven't drawn in 10 years because that's not part of their job anymore. You have people who know exactly how to make everything in this structure, and it removes like weird feedback. I'm sure anybody who's done any client work has gotten like weird feedback, especially from the art standpoint, like, oh, make it pop more, like these are all real. It looks too busy, can you add more noise? Like what? What does that mean? Those are such contrary concepts. I don't know what's wrong, but I'll know it when I see it. Like, cool, so you also get to be a mind reader as well as an artist. And like, you know, any good professional artist, you can kind of figure out, like, if this is the guy who really likes skulls that are on fire, probably that means you just need to put in more skulls that are on fire. But that guesswork process kind of like gums up the works. And this is real. The game should be like Diablo 3, but really cute, and there's a metagame that's basically Farmville meets Candy Crush meets Peggle. I don't know, let's pull names out of a hat. And so when you have everybody who is involved in the game process, they know what they're doing because they're doing it every day, you remove that infuriating level of people being disconnected with what's actually needed to make a good game. And this is one I'm guilty of. I give quantifiable numbers to things that you can't quantify, but to my credit, the art team always like does a bang-up job when I say inane like this, so it's great. So on the level of mistakes, I do volunteer work for this organization called Girls Learning Code. Super great org, they do awesome work. And I find that it has allowed me to see really interesting ways that people's brains work when they're trying to do new things. So all the girls are like so terrified, like they're like 8, 9 years old and they're learning to use game engines for the first time, and they're learning like basic programming logic for the first time. And they're all so terrified of making a mistake that like they don't want to try anything. They want to know exactly how high this character needs to jump. Is it 6 or is it 7? They don't want to see what happens when you put in 20. So they're always like putting up their hand and being like, oh, what do I do? I'm not sure. And I keep telling them like, just try it and see what happens and see if you fail. and make mistakes. And when I tell them, please make mistakes, they look at me like I'm a crazy person. They're like, why would I make a mistake? I'm going to get in trouble if I make a mistake. I'm like, no, making mistakes is how you learn. It's how you know if something works or not. It's how you are proving against your own assumptions on things. So I had one girl raise her hand and say, what mistakes am I allowed to make, though? Like, what mistakes do you want me to make? And it's just so totally, like, missing the point of, like, there's not a right and wrong answer in a creative decision. It's something that you arrive at as part of a process, which is why whenever people talk about art blocks, I think it's kind of a silly thing to talk about having a creative block when you're a professional, because all of these things you're making, they're part of a process. They're part of a formula. So this mentality of, like, what mistakes am I allowed to make? I think that you see this in adults, too, because they are part, you know, they grew up in the same educational system that instills this sort of mentality in people that you can only do one thing one way. And I think if we really want to make truly good games and how competitive this market is, we need to be able to encourage our people to make mistakes and let them know that there's not a mistake. It's you're proving whether something works or not, and it's part of a deductive process in making a creative decision. So the nice thing is, when you have no hierarchy, essentially, like, I know everyone's always like, yeah, we don't have a hierarchy, but you kind of have like a flatterer hierarchy, and you have people not being afraid of making mistakes, and you have people trying out new things and just trying to build each other up. It's so much easier to bring out the best in everyone, because nobody's terrified of, like, well, I'm bad at backgrounds, so I'm just gonna, like, work my way through this background and hope nobody notices what a bad job I did. Because you can just turn to the person next to you and be like, hey man, I'm having a really rough time with this background. I took a crack at it. I'm not really feeling the palette. Can you try it out and see what happens? There's not a weird, like, you bringing yourself down a level to ask for help. So what ultimately happens is everybody brings their best to the table, and we can all, like, build each other up more. And it means that we collaborate a lot more. A lot of the art we make at our company, it's not like one person makes one piece of art and that's all they're on. We sort of swap and trade because some people will see things that somebody else doesn't. So we're sort of just trying to be catalysts for each other as well. Another thing we do now is we have complete transparency in the company. We don't really, like, do NDAs anymore. If we want to talk about our games, we're going to talk about our games, because I've noticed that, like, all the best indie games are coming from people who are, like, really, really friendly and really excited to talk about them. And I'm willing to bet that's not a coincidence, because if you're showing your game to people and talking about it, that is, like, part of the organic design process. That it means that you're getting feedback from people. And I think the level of secrecy that you see in AAA companies, for obvious reasons, because of the kind of IPs they're working with, I don't know if it's fully translatable to indie games. But at any rate, everything is transparent now. We let people know, like, exactly what our revenue is within the studio, exactly how we're doing in the marketplace, and that wasn't something that we did when we were a larger company. And I think the great thing is that, like, if you give people information on how good our studio is doing, it lets them know that they are part of it doing better, and they are more incentivized to care more. And just having people know that they're getting this information, it makes them feel more valued, because you're not treating them like some cog in the system. You're treating them like they're part of the overall success of this company. Another thing we don't do is planning for crunch time anymore, and I think that that is also indicative of the fact that we don't have so many super high-level managers anymore. Because when someone's like a VP who has never made a game and doesn't do creative stuff as much, they see it as like, well, if we can get people to work for 80 hours a week, why wouldn't we do that? It's double work. That's great. But anyone who's done creative work, you know that that's not how it happens. Like, there's a real quick fall off on your quality, and you get diminishing returns on people's time. So, like, yeah, you can do a death march and get people to work twice as long, but their work is going to be hot garbage. Like, it's not going to be good at that point. So we used to have tons of overtime, and it was just, like, part of the company. And the thing was, like, we scheduled it. We scheduled the assumption that people would be working 60, 80-hour, 90-hour weeks or whatever. And that was seen as a prudent business decision. And we will crunch sometimes now, but it's not something we plan for. It's more like, man, I can make this feature way better if I work for 4 hours on a Saturday. So it's kind of like voluntary overtime, which is something that, like, surprisingly will happen if you treat people well, but it happens in a healthy way that doesn't totally mess up the quality of your game. Because now we have almost no crunch time, and the games look better and are more fun. So clearly there's something there. The only thing is that, like, with this system of, like, giving people all of this agency over what they're doing, it's really important to hire the proper people. It's really, really important to make sure your hiring decisions are good. Because when your structure looks like this, one person not fitting into that system, or one person really dropping the ball and not caring, it can, like, totally fall apart. So that's kind of one of the danger points. So like we're not afraid to fire people if they're not working in the system, but the nice thing is that we've been so careful in our hiring process that we haven't had to fire anybody because we've kind of vetoed whether or not somebody is going to fit and whether they're going to work hard or whether they're good at their job just based on interviews. So that's worked pretty well. I'm going to go really fast through what our new art pipeline flow looks like with all of this, with our new system. So I'm really big on visual research, but I try not to do visual research that is from other games. I try to not look at other games at all. 5 minutes? Okay, cool. I try to look at things that are totally unrelated. So this is visual research for our Project Giants game. So I looked at like molecular gastronomy and fashion and like look at what's in the visual ethos for society at that time. Because if you're just looking at games, you're going to start getting derivative. And in the age of how overpopulated the App Store is, you need to have a unique vision of what your game is going to look like. So we looked at like the sculptural work of Henry Moore and that kind of visual language. And then we do super, super quick concept paintings. And then we garbage all the ones that don't work. And then we kind of take it to a more finalized place. So we were kind of like looking at these abstract shapes as a way of having like a low poly style that wasn't exactly like that low poly style that was really popular right then. I'm also really into mood boards. So it's basically like you take all your visual research, you jam it on one board, and you just have it open all the time whenever you're doing any concept art. So we kind of have two different kinds of mood boards. This is like a spiritual mood board that we put together for a Gastrobots game. So we're just looking at like general shape language and palettes that are indicative of retrofuturism, because that's the kind of game design we were going with. And then there's more specific ones where it's like retrofuturism, but as applied to graphic design and typography. And that kind of gets us to like more specific UI things. Another thing we do is I'm really big on color scripting. So if anyone's aware of how VizDev works in film, color scripting is basically like you're taking your main shots and you're laying down rough colors because the colors will emphasize the emotional crescendo of the film. So we take that general concept, we apply it to the linear rollout of the gameplay and make sure that our palettes, while working as a unified palette, also helps to bring players through the sort of gameplay atmospheres we have. Journey has a really great color script. They also do this, so check it out. And then we take the general idea of color scripting and we apply it to our wireframes as well. So we try to make sure that our core game loop has the kind of color cues and emotional cues in that like smaller context that also help the gameplay feel good. Because you don't want to just like hit people with super bright, crazy colors all the time. You kind of need to subdue it a little bit. Yeah, and so this is kind of like where we went with the retrofuturism, like still super colorful and stuff, but like the shape language was totally influenced by the visual research we did. And then we do so many sketches, like we sketch like crazy. These are just for like the animals that are in the game. So we go nuts, and this is like part of that philosophy of don't be afraid to make mistakes, because we just did hundreds of these, and then we deduced down what the proper designs were. And though it seems like more work in the upfront, especially if you're not used to like the art process, it actually saves us time in the long run because we don't have to go back and revise things because we do all the iteration up front. And then we just try to figure out what our render style is going to be. And this is kind of the final designs we went with, where we're trying to make a very simplified game because there's tons of these on the screen at the same time. And we went through the same process with the main character. We do a lot of sketches that don't work, and that doesn't matter because we throw them on paper, because sometimes knowing what you don't want to do is just as important as knowing what you do want to do. So this is kind of the difference between like our final design and our very first sketch that were like a couple months apart. And then you get to do all your crazy like customization stuff and kind of play around with that. And it's easier to feel comfortable in iterating on customization when you've like really nailed that core design because you just drew it forever. Yep, so iterate until everyone's happy. At the end of the day, this is how I see how visual design works. It is the first handshake you have with someone. It's the plating of a dish of food that you make. So you know, you might want to be like a super dirty breakfast burrito if that's like what your thing is going to be. If you're like, I'm going to make breakfast burritos for people. But make sure it doesn't look like you're going to give somebody food poisoning. And I'm not saying everything needs to look like high art. Not everything needs to be hyper polished and maybe inaccessible to people. But you need to make sure that you're aware of the fact that the initial judgment people are going to make on your game is going to be what it looks like. Especially in how overcrowded the App Store is. We can't get away with just having everything be vectored with a black stroke and one and done, and that's fine. You really need to put a ton of time into whether or not the first impression is going to be indicative of what your core game design is going to be, and it needs to be something that you spend a lot of time on. And a lot of people tend to undervalue previs for making their whole game work, and it's so, so important because it ultimately leads to whether or not people have a good initial impression of your game. And at the end of the day, too, just like find what your studio's voice is and stick with that and be okay with that, and don't try to be something you're not. Because the kind of studios that people love, the ones that have crazy fan bases, they have a specific style to their games across the board. Like Blizzard games all have a certain vibe to them. Double Fine has a super adamant fan base, and they have a particular style and atmosphere to what their games are. So I think it's really important as an indie studio, like, find what you are and be good with that, and help people raise their voices up and contribute to part of that whole, because that's what's going to make you stand out, and that's what's going to make your games memorable. And also, it's going to just make everyone so much happier that, like, the overall mentality of the people at our studio is one of a bunch of people who actually love each other and care about each other and are excited to come to work every day. And that makes making games so much better. And I really think that there is something to it, because the overall projects we're making are so much stronger than they were a few years ago. So clearly something's working there. And that's my talk. Any questions, anyone? I know that was a lot. Yeah. Oh, right.
Are you aware of design thinking at Stanford D School?
No.
That's what you're talking about.
Oh.
We can talk some more about it
Cool,
afterwards,
yeah.
if you like.
That'd be great. Yeah, I mean, most of this stuff is rooted in like core principles of art making as applied to video games, where it typically isn't. So yeah, I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Hi.
Hi.
How do you know what kind of games to do next? What's your process?
So we usually have internal hackathons in our studio. So once we're kind of finishing up on one project, we'll take 1 week where everybody makes whatever kind of game prototype they want to, either by themselves or as part of a smaller team. And we iterate on these prototypes, get them to a level of polish where we can kind of figure out if the game's going to be fun or not. And if we find anything meaningful within that process, then we take those and actually start full production on them. So our Gastrobots game was a game that, like, 2 people in our studio made in an internal hackathon where they just like riffed on this thing, and it looked totally different, but the core game mechanic we identified as being fun. So then that's where we kind of started talking about taking it to a more finished level. So yeah, so everyone is part of that process. It's not just one person who's picking the game designs.
Any more?
Great talk, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
So how have you, the challenge of moving from 50 to 6, and then being able to retain those 6 and be able to have that ownership, which is awesome, by the way, but how do you, what sort of incentives do you offer those 6 people so they have ownership? Do they get stake in the company, or do they, do they have profit sharing, or what sort of stuff are you rolling out for that? Yeah, so from a monetary standpoint,
everyone that works at our company does have shares in the company, so they're kind of invested financially that way. We do also have a program in our studio where if anyone wants to make a game on the side, we like talk to them about it, and they can make it, and we'll do a like super generous rev share for them. A lot of studios, it's like if you make something, it belongs to the company, so we don't do that either. And we also just have a weird culture of like, if you're not happy about some part of your job, we like sit down and talk about it. And I know that sounds super basic, but it's part of being like kind of friends with everyone you work with, is that like people are not reluctant to be like, hey, I really hate this part about my job, and I hate it when this happens, and let's talk about how to make that better. Like, those are conversations that we're always having to kind of try to make people happy. And just from an art standpoint, like, we have a ton of creative freedom. We get to decide as a team like what the best visual direction is, and I think a lot of places you're kind of told to do a thing, and you have to do that thing whether or not you agree with it. So just from a creative standpoint, having more agency makes it a much better place to work, at least in my opinion and in my experiences. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Cool. Yep.
How you doing? I think you had a stellar presentation.
Thank
really
you.
good. And with regard to the dynamics of your company, I think you guys are working in a appropriate direction. I think it's much better for indie studios to really, consolidate, and it's about quality over quantity. And in doing so, I would like to know, like, what have the fans thought, with regards to the games that you made early on in comparison to the games that you made now, since you've made some of these changes?
overall, it's been really positive. It's been really amazing seeing the difference in like showing a prototype of our older games that didn't have the same level of visual panache as opposed to what we do now, that we actually get people being like genuinely excited and smiling about things. We recently had our Gastrobots game at we're from Toronto, and so there was like this local game festival that we had a demo of our game at, and we were seeing all these people like seeing our booth and seeing the art and like just beelining it for it, and we didn't have that kind of emotional response from people. And even like the Project Giants game that we're working on, like I've had so many super long involved conversations with people about like what they think about the general premise of the game. So overall, like I think people have been much more invested in the types of games we're making and are kind of drawn to them a lot more quickly. So we've definitely seen a difference in people's overall reactions. Probably slightly biased because it's like we're talking to other people who are making games. So our Gastrobots game is releasing in about a month. So that'll sort of be the proving ground for how the audiences take it. But I do think we're getting into a place where people who consume mobile games have a higher standard for what they expect visually than they did, you know, in 2009, 2010 when it was earlier, because a bunch of people are bringing their game up, and that's kind of what the standard is becoming now. So I do think it's very important, and people notice, and people make a lot more comments, I find, in the App Store about graphics being not good enough, whereas before they were like, this is a game that exists on my phone, and I like it just fine. So it's, yeah, no, overall it's been very good, for sure. Mm-hmm.
It's a great talk.
Thank you.
So you talked a lot about the changes in the design and the color style and art style. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, as a game, it needs to be like really fun. Like, what kind of changes you made in the old company versus a new company to make sure it's fun? Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea of like iterating on our art and trying things over and sketching things out, we also apply that mentality to our game design. I talked about it a little bit less because art is kind of like my thing at the studio, but we always do a very simple prototype, and like the way we do our internal hackathons where we just make a bunch of prototypes and try it out, that's a totally new thing. Like in our old company, we would sort of someone would write the GDD, like this is what the game is going to be, and then we would make that thing. And even if we were playing it throughout and someone was like, guys, this isn't very fun, like people just were kind of like, whatever, we already started making it, keep going. So people were not willing to garbage something that wasn't working before. Which again sounds like so obvious, but it wasn't something that was being done. So now we work more iteratively in the design. We start simple and then we build upon that. And if something isn't working, we're no longer afraid to just cut our losses. Because it's better to put a month into a prototype, identify it doesn't work, and then do something that does work, rather than to just like, let's drive it into the ground because we already started. That's not like a good economic way of doing things. So basically, yeah, we iterate more. We're more willing to admit our mistakes, and we're much more adaptive now in that regard.
All right. So I guess that wraps it up for now. Lindsay, thank you very much for your insight. Give her a big round of applause.